Good evening, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 28th year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It's a wider net than that, though. We have had on other brands of artists, sculptors, musicians, actors. So if you have an idea for a guest who might be good for the Writer's Block, a writer or stranger kind of artist, watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original productions out of Cape Ann TV are for and about Cape Ann and the result of cable access television. This is a wonderful community property, community asset, and you don't get this if you subscribe to Dish. So don't pay attention to those ads. You stick with cable, you watch the Writer's Block and all the rest of our wonderful programming here on Cape Ann TV. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a writer, a memoirist by the name of Clem Schoenebeck, and I'm going to read the bio note about Clem Schoenebeck from his new book, Dancing with Fireflies. Clemens Carl Schoenebeck has had poetry published in the Aurorian, Midwest Poetry Review, Caribbean Writer, Ibbotson Street Press, Small Brushes Adept Press. 3 of his poems have been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, a very distinguished nomination, I might point out. His 9/11 poem, For the Angels Unwinged, was published in the Aurorian's Favorites edition, celebrating their first 15 years of poetry. Several of his short stories have won prizes in the Writers' World Competition, Marblehead Festival of Arts. In 2012, he won both poetry and fiction prizes. His winning poem was also the winner of the Marcia Donor Award. In addition, he was named the winner of the first Georgette Beck Award for fiction writing. He lives on the North Shore of Boston with his wife, Bonnie. His daughter's family lives nearby. His granddaughters are usually available for lunch. Welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you, John. Very kind of you to have me.
I like that introduction because it points out that you're a multi-talented writer. You are with us this evening because of Dancing with Fireflies, a memoir, a wonderful, emotional, striking memoir, but you are very much a poet and also a writer of fiction.
Yes, and sometimes I don't know where the one starts and the other stops, but the writing, I was introduced to all this through poetry. I thought sort of accidental. I was inspired to write my first poetry-like bit of putting words on the paper when I saw my first granddaughter born in my, 30 minutes after she was born in my daughter's arms, and something happened to me from that point, and it eventually led to my writing this story, which was about my healing with my mother, who was schizophrenic.
The book is memoir and prose, but you begin it with a poem and you close it with a poem.
Right.
Now, as you mentioned, this is a memoir about your mother and you dealing with your mother's challenging life.
Exactly.
Tell us about that.
My mother was labeled paranoid schizophrenic. Her symptoms really started before her marriage to my father, but they were sort of under wraps, and she was one of 11 children in a big family, very rigid, devout Catholicism, and there was a lot of idea that we'll pray this away, and when my mother met my father and they eventually married, I think the whole family was pretty relieved that my mother was now in somebody else's hands, but her symptoms were rather under wraps, and then I found later through reading the medical records of my mother's time in a mental hospital, which the hospital very kindly released to me when I had questions about whether I was remembering things accurately when writing this. It was obvious through reading the medical records that, and this was back in 1945, is that the people were very kind and cared about her, but also I found a very striking comment that her symptoms really exacerbated upon the birth of her first son, and that's me. So we have a pretty profound connection in that way.
So, as your wife says, you quote her in the book, after you visit the old hospital where your mother
Right.
had been
Yes.
had been resident, that your wife says you have some work to do.
It's true.
Did you feel that?
I felt there was some kind of unrest, and what happened is that this is many years after my mother died. I believe it was about 11 years after she died, and we were going home to State College, Pennsylvania, to visit my father, who was then 92, and on the way we stopped for lunch. We were about 45 miles away from State College, and we stopped in a truck stop, the Buckhorn Truck Plaza. I'll never forget it. There was a display of black and white photography, and I was stunned in front of one of the pictures. It was the picture of the mental hospital where my mother was sent when I was 8 years old, and I saw this picture, and I was just frozen. And then my wife saw the picture, and we started talking about it. The hospital was 5 miles down the road, and my wife said, "I think it's time for you to go visit." And I thought, well, okay. And make a long story short, we found it, and I got out of the car, and I had always been sort of skeptical when my wife was worked as a psychotherapist, and I always sort of wondered about the word flashback. I got out of the car, and I stood there, and I saw the big dark door that my father went through when I was 8 years old, and we were going for our first visit to see her.
And you remember
and
that
I went
visit?
back. I went back there, and it was then after that weekend of talking with my father, who very, very graciously was able to answer my questions and fill in the blanks. And on the return trip to Swampscott, where I live, going back home, we passed the sign to the hospital, and I was totally silent. And my wife said, "Honey, you have work to do." And it was absolutely right. And then I wrote the poem, which is at the end of this story.
There's a very nice picture in here of, I want to see if I can find it immediately, of your mother, Sophie Henrietta Droege.
Oh, her first communion picture.
No, it was...
It'd be near the back.
It's an adult picture.
Yeah, that
And
would be very close to the back there. With, I
Well-
think it's real close to the very back. With, you're getting close.
I'll find
There,
it.
it would be just before the Vespers poem, I think. Oh, I bet it's after the Vespers poem. That's there. There you go.
Here,
There
see if
she
we can
is.
hold this up. I'll hold this
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Would you describe what we're looking at there?
Well,
Clem?
what we're looking at here, my brothers, my youngest brother Alfred in the middle, my next brother Bill, and I was the oldest, had a lot more hair then. I was the oldest of the three, and I always tried to protect my brothers. I had this image in growing up. The shorthand would be that I always stepped between my brothers and my mother, and then of course on the bottom is my mother and my father. And
Maybe go back and explain that there was danger to the boys
yes,
from your mother. Can you give us
Yes.
some background on that?
my mother began to hear voices, actually heard voices when she was younger. Her own father died in an accident involving fire when she was 8 or 10 years old, and she had that imagery of hellfire and brimstone. It just frightened her, and I think it contributed to her distress for the rest of her life. And but when we were growing up, if she was in a dark place where she was hearing the voices,
Excuse me,
yeah.
by dark place, you mean psychologically dark?
Psychologically
or when the
dark.
lights were
Yeah,
low?
absolutely, just psychologically a dark place. She could be very unpredictable. She would hear through the telephone wires voices, and she had fears that the devil's voices would affect her sons. And so sometimes I think out of fear, if she felt that we were misbehaving, she could be pretty strict once in a while. Someone would get slapped, and I sort of had this image that I had to protect my brothers and stand between my brothers and my mother. In reality, it might have been more of an image than reality, but sometimes it's how it worked.
Well, your father
Yeah.
did mention that
Right.
his fear of for her doing possibly
Exactly. My father was a rock. He was very, very steady, and it was very difficult. He was a very stubborn, determined German, and he perhaps didn't know how to be soft around this. He only knew how to muscle his way through it and just try to be. He was like a rock, and so we had that stability there. And there were times when my mother was in a wonderful mood, and the voices weren't there, the images weren't there, and she, particularly when we would get into some of the religious holidays, and there would always be a frenetic period of time when we had to get the house clean and everything to honor whatever the saint was, or Christmas or whatever. But then when she calmed down, she felt uplifted. She could be fun. We could laugh with her. She could be a wonderful cook, made some great pies. So we didn't have all gloom and doom. We had our moments of being pretty happy, you know.
Was that seemingly randomly sporadic, or was it because of medication or treatment? Or
No, it was more sporadic. We talked a little bit about medication. I think that the stage that my mother was in at that time, if they had had the perfect pill that would cure her schizophrenia, she would have thought that you were trying to drug her or dope her, as she said.
Even at that time, though, the best medications were sledgehammers.
Exactly.
By our standards.
Exactly. And I really, truly, the strides they've made in treatment today, it's like night and day. But the wonderful thing, as I mentioned, when I did get access to the medical records, my breath was taken away by the language and the 10 or 12 pages of records the hospital forwarded to me. The words of the clinicians, the doctors, the nurses, the helpers. It was not judgmental. It was clear that they were objective, and they really sincerely wanted to be of help to my mother. And I never understood that at the time.
That's heartening.
It is.
It's part
Absolutely.
of your journey back.
Absolutely. Yes. So.
I want to talk a little bit about the structure. I enjoyed the overall structure.
Right.
You begin with that trip.
Yes.
So we're in the present.
Yes.
Or the virtual present of the book.
Exactly.
And then you go back and talk about your youth and growing up.
Exactly.
Then you come back to the present.
It's
then you
true.
go back, and there's a nice tension there, going back and forth and back and
Yes.
forth. And did that evolve, or was that part of the lightning that struck with the first idea of the book?
Yes, what had actually is a very good question. I had been invited, after I had been writing poetry for a while, I had been invited into a short story writers group where there were 4 or 5 of us, and my friends we call ourselves the Marblehead Writers Group. And my contributions to the group very often were little short stories about my childhood. There was a story in here about my first baseball mitt. There was a 4th of July story where my mother had been in a bad place, and my brothers and I went to the carnival and celebrated, came back, and a bunch of short stories. And I ran out of ideas for my writers group, and one of them said, well, why don't you write your memoir? And I said, I don't know how to write a memoir. And they said, you've already started it. There were 5 or 6 short stories, which I did weave into it. Mm-hmm. So I had that sense of where I was in my family history with these stories. And then on that long weekend when I saw the hospital and had my flashback, had my conversation with my father. There were questions that I could ask him about my mother's history that started to tie it together.
The visit with your father.
Yes. And then when I
92.
went back that weekend, it's sort of like the book starts with a visit to my father, ends with the Vespers poem that I wrote 2-3 days later, but then I filled the whole history in between. So I thought, how am I going to get from here to there? And it's just that I had to make this big arch of my history and sometimes touching base with the present. But it was sort of accidental that it came out that way, but I don't think I could have written it any other way.
Vespers, by the way, is a liturgical name for afternoon
prayers. Yes. Yeah. And where that came from is when my father took me at the age of 8 to visit my mother at that visit that I recalled, when it was like there was one big waiting room. It was a Saturday afternoon, and all of the, I wanted to call them inmates, but all of the patients were in rocking chairs in a big semicircle, and the visitors were clustered in between, with my mother was in her rocking chair, and we had this conversation, and it was I was just starting to get comfortable with it. And then in the mid-afternoon, as the light goes down, I was told this by people who, therapists who work with really disturbed mental patients, the diminished afternoon light can be agitating.
Really?
Yes, and I didn't know that. So we were sitting there in front of my mother, and all of a sudden, one person started to rock, and then another patient started to rock, and I could see my mother's eyes searching around, and she was looking at me, and I could see fear in her eyes. And then she started rocking. It was like a trance, and she got into this, and the rocking went back, and I actually heard people murmuring, and the only thing I could think was the idea of speaking in tongues or something, but just this murmuring going on, and it was scary. And later, toward the end of that, as I reflect in the poem, when it was time to leave, I got up, and my mother, she really clutched me. She didn't want me to leave, but as I left and looked back, I eventually looked at that experience as Vespers, the afternoon prayers, and whatever it was those patients were feeling through the rocking, the rhythmic back and forth, and their whatever was coming out of their mouths or their hearts or their souls, who knows. I considered that to be Vespers, and it was my take on it. And when I wrote that poem, in the actual writing of the poem over a period of 2 nights, I felt like I had healed with my mother, and it was poetry.
The work was done.
Yes, the poetry.
You were free to love her, I think you said.
That's what it was.
You felt like.
Absolutely.
So, it's very moving. I wonder if I could ask you, this is kind of dropping the bounds,
sure,
to read a passage.
Of course.
That's maybe a favorite passage of yours that kind of reflects the tone,
right,
or the subject matter, just
right,
for a minute
sure,
or two.
Yes, actually,
I had some passages marked, but it's better if you choose.
Right. I'll tell you what I can read here. My mother, I have a First Communion picture of her. It's in here. You can't really see it in here, but I wish I had brought it. It's a treasure. She's in her white gown, holding her prayer book, and with this beautiful, I'm so sorry I didn't bring the portrait, but one of my favorite things is that I took this picture and I described it, and it says a lot about my mother at this young age and where she was going. And so I have this beautiful picture of her sitting there as I described. So I start to describe it. I found this framed picture and so on, and then it's her First Communion picture. So my writing that I think expresses what I was able to feel about my mother. It is the day of Sophie Henrietta Drogi's First Holy Communion. My mother's face is softened by the available light which comes from over her right shoulder, leaving her left side dimly shadowed. Her sweet face reflects her love of Jesus in that luminosity, the glow not harsh, but fluidly radiant on her dress. Her right cheek looks as if it would feel warm against my own cheek if I held my face up to hers on the other side of the glass. My mother's smile is subtle, hopeful, watchful, looking for Jesus. Her smile says, I believe. Her eyes are shaped like almonds, each eyebrow traced like the thin outline of a floating gull's wing. Can a nose be perfect? Not too big or small, not too sharp or blunt. My mother's nose is perfect, with a straight line running down the ridge between the sunlit right side and the shaded left half of her face. Her lips are straight, not the slightest upward curl at the ends, and yet her smile takes hold of me, blurs me in my eyes and my heart. The outline of her face is soft and symmetrical, tapered to a delicately rounded chin, a faint shadow brushed beneath her lower lip, a hint of a dimple, something saved for a future smile. She confidently looks out from her portrait, the unshadowed eye focused on me. She is speaking to me. I am here, she seems to say. Everything about me is in this picture. It's as if that image, with its black and white contrast, is a metaphor for the light and shadows my mother would come to know. One crucifix, darkly blurred behind her, another glinting in hopeful clarity beside her. Something else about this portrait. I look at her left eye on the cloudy side of her face. If I study it carefully, hold it in just the right slant of sun, I see her searching for Jesus in the unlit places. Already, Sophie Henrietta Droege can see in the darkness.
Very nicely done. Very, very nicely
Thank you.
done. And I wanted to underline, I think you mentioned this, that both your family and hers, both your mother's family and your father's family were very devout Roman Catholic
Yes.
German immigrants.
Right, exactly.
The first or second generation.
Exactly. My father came here from Germany when he was 20 years old. He wasn't as dogmatic about the religion as was my mother, but he believed that, that our Sunday mornings were tailored to go to church and get that part of what we're supposed to get. So.
I know from my own experience that a very devout faith can make you think that faith will fix everything. It's almost a Christian Science attitude in many ways, and it's sadly incorrect.
Exactly.
And doesn't work.
And this was a tough lesson for me because as a young child, I was taught, like, you be good and you pray, and if you're good enough, Jesus will take care of you. Well, I prayed a lot that he fixed my mother, and when it didn't happen, I kept thinking, well, maybe I'm not good enough. And that, if I had to look back, reflect back, that was one of the things that I regret about that childhood religion, that there could not have been a more comprehensive, compassionate understanding without blaming God for not fixing it.
I think of that often because of my own background, but always in terms of cancer, when people say, you got to fight it.
Yes.
And meditate, and then if it comes back,
it's your fault. You didn't meditate hard enough.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
We're getting a little close, and I want to ask you some technical questions.
Yes.
How long did it take you to write this?
I really spent, actually, if I count the time when I started the short stories, I could easily say 5 or 6 years, but when I really got into this as a project, I still probably spent a good 3 years, and I wrote a couple manuscripts, and then my friend Dennis Must, who was the author who encouraged me to do this, who was a dental patient of mine, I went to an editor that he recommended.
So I'm going to hold this up again. Yeah. This is Dancing with Fireflies, excuse me, with the nice cover done by a former nationally known illustrator, cartoonist, I guess you would say. Your cousin.
My cousin.
Where is this available?
On Amazon.
Amazon.
I did it through CreateSpace after I had a few near misses with some publishers. They said if I was better known, they would have published
It's a
it.
crowded
And
market
I got a
out
big
there.
name. I got 11 letters, and Stephen King only has 4. So,
Congratulations.
right.
How would you advise others? We have viewers out there, I'm sure, who are thinking about writing their own histories, their own challenges and coming through. What
Yeah.
would you advise them to do, or how would you say they should start?
Well, I think, first of all, if you think you have a story and you're not sure, what have you got to lose by taking notes? Fill a notebook, just whatever thoughts come into your mind, and write down all the stories that you remember that touched you in some way. And then I think you have to. I'm no expert. You would be far more of that, but I think it's very helpful to then have a couple of trusted readers, and not necessarily people that know you too well. My friend Dennis Must, who was the writer that encouraged me to do
That's
this.
interesting.
Yes, and he said at the time, I gave him the manuscript, and he said, "This is terrific. If it's just for your brothers and your writers group, don't touch it." I had poetry in it and everything else. And then he said, "But if you're going to, quote, get it out there," and I didn't really know what he meant by that, "it needs the firm hand of an editor who does not know you." And finally, I understood what that meant, and I sent it to a woman named Paulette Bates Alden, who was fabulous and kind of brought me down to where I had to be. But I think that if somebody wants to do that, have a trusted reader. Maybe you're going to start with friends, but eventually
Start
get
with
to
friends,
somebody.
because you need
Yes,
encouragement.
you need
But
encouragement.
Then you have to separate yourself from people who are going to say, "Wonderful, I just loved it. What'd you like about it?" "Oh, everything."
Everything, right? Exactly.
Which is just not a helpful,
Exactly.
reaction if you want to
Exactly.
get it out there.
It's true. And Paulette Bates Alden, incidentally, on the one page that I thought was heroic and just the whole world needed it, in her manuscript, she circled it and put an arrow in the margin, and it said, "Look, Ma, I'm writing." So you do need that, but only after you've had some encouragement.
One of Elmore Leonard's, the mystery writer, Elmore Leonard's advice to writers was, if it looks like writing, scratch it out.
That's terrific.
advice.
Yeah, it's good advice. Yeah.
We're almost through with our
Yes.
fast half hour.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that half hour very
Thank
much,
you.
Clem Schonebeck, and thank you very much indeed for sharing this memoir, which is moving and
Thank you.
interesting and very, very well written.
Thank
and I
you.
say that not as a friend, I don't know
Yes.
you well,
Thank you.
but as an objective reader.
Thank you. And my hope would be that, the feedback that I've had, that it is hopeful and encouraging. It's not a downer. It's that
It is
to
not.
be
No, it's very
lifted up.
positive.
And
Ends in love.
I've had feedback from many people who said now they're talking with their siblings about stuff that they had to keep secret.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. So.
I want to thank all of you out there in TV land for watching the Writer's Block. If you have learned something from Clem Schonebeck about his book, Dancing with Fireflies, and coming to a realization and an acceptance of a challenging life he had growing up with his mother, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.